Welcome, students. This is a podcast covering another lecture topic. The lecture topic for today is what I call Nationalism Revisited. And what we're going to take a look at today is the impact or the effect of the building power of nationalism as a state ideology, and the effect that it had in producing two significant countries. We have the creation of the state of Italy in 1861, and we have the creation of the state of Germany in 1871. And those two powers, Germany in particular being the more important of the two countries, would dramatically impact and alter the course of world history, especially in the case of Germany in the form of World War I and World War II. So, last time we were talking about nationalism, it was in the lecture that we did on what I called the Isms 1. And again, just to refresh our memory, nationalism is the idea of creating an identity that revolves and centers in the idea of the state being your primary organizer and, if you will, consolidator of the people within a given region. And so the idea of nationalism, again, is to create that love of country, that dedication, and it goes beyond that even to being that identity, that kind of by which a person defines themselves, and then building on that deep commitment and kind of creating programs, nationalistic programs, usually aimed towards expansion and getting the people to rally behind that cause. Quite honestly, if you paid attention to the previous presidential election in America, you would see that that was one of the kind of rallying points of the Trump campaign, was to kind of play upon the idea of nationalism and kind of cementing or reinforcing that idea of the United States as a nation within the world as opposed to a more global entity. So that's I think that's shows you the power of nationalism and how it continues to kind of impact us today. Now, for the 1860s, the power of nationalism was very prominent. As we said before, it was born out of the French Revolution, 1810, 1815, when the revolution ended, and it only continued to build. We see our first big kind of landmark issue or landmark effect of nationalism come about in 1848. In the 1840s, late 1840s, the Italians, the individual city-states that made up the region we call the Italian Peninsula, they began to come together with the idea of merging all of their distinct governments into one large, quote, Italian state, or Italy. That started in 1848. The movement built. The main problem that they foresaw, though, was who would be the, quote, king or leader of this Italian country. It seemed like the only person that they could settle on was the Roman Catholic Church Pope or leader. And so the movement was to kind of coalesce the Italian people into one Catholic nation behind the leadership of the papacy, and that gained a lot of steam. However, as the situation grew more kind of volatile and tension and aggressively filled, basically the papacy pulled out of that Italian unification effort in the 1840s, and as a result, that kind of movement, it didn't die, but it kind of lost its steam for about 20 years. At the same time, we see in terms of the Germanic peoples, the Germanic areas, parts of Austria, parts of Prussia, and in particular those small little German states around those countries, Bavaria, Hohenstaufen, Saxony, etc. We saw a similar type of movement where there was a desire to unify the German people into one giant state. They even went so far as to craft a constitution for this so-called German state. It was called the Frankfurt Parliament, and they then went to Austria to see if Austria would be interested in merging under this new constitution. Austria declined. They went to Prussia. Prussia also, the leader of Prussia, the Kaiser of Prussia, declined also because of the fact that the Frankfurt Parliament Constitution was a fairly liberal, constitutional-based ideal of government, and the Austrian government and both the Prussian government, they both had a fairly strong kingship, and they did not want to unify under this new, more people-based government. So we see the movements of nationalism trying, and we see these question marks being raised, but they don't exactly come to fruition. Now, if you see on the first slide, it's kind of a weird slide. It talks about the Crimean War. And you might ask, what does the Crimean War have to do with nationalism? But it's a war fought for nationalism. And what it is it actually wound up being a war between England and France. First time England and France had actually worked together politically, diplomatically for quite some time. England and France joined forces to try and prevent Russia, which was traditionally an ally of the French. It worked to prevent Russia from gaining access to the Mediterranean Sea through the Crimean Peninsula. And this war, which was extremely bloody and extremely hard fought, eventually resulted in an English-French victory. And so how does it connect to nationalism? Well, the Crimean Peninsula had nothing and was nowhere near France or England. But the reason why England and France banded together to prevent the Russian expansion was because of this idea that would in fact make Russia more powerful, which would then limit the power of either France or England as a nation. And so we call this kind of strategy a balance of power diplomatic strategy. And so the Crimean War is kind of like one of those events you can point to show a changing trend in the state politics of Europe. Now nations were more thinking about their nationalistic ideas or their nationalistic prestige as opposed to something that directly related to them. Okay? Now, with that being said, let's take a look at the second Italian unification effort, which took place in the late 1850s. Basically, that nationalistic drive was still there. And in particular, Camilla Cavour, who you see on the outline, Camilla Cavour was the prime minister of a small but powerful country called Piedmont, Sardinia. And it was an Italian, it was a country in Italy on the Italian peninsula. And he had the desire to merge Italy under Sardinia Piedmont's government. At the same time, there were nationalistic revolutions taking place in the southern Italian peninsula, in the kingdom we call the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies or the Kingdom of Naples. Excuse me. And so what happened in the late 1850s and early 1860s is that these two opposing movements, independence movements in the South, led by a couple of different leaders, and a movement in the North on the part of Sardinia Piedmont to consolidate power and force a merger, eventually led to a race for both parties, one led by Giuseppe Garibaldi, who was a revolutionary from the South, and Camilla Cavour, who was a prime minister of Sardinia Piedmont. There was a race to see who could get to Rome first and claim it as the capital of this newly crafted idea that would be the state of Italy. Long story short, Sardinia Piedmont was able to merge all the northern kingdoms of Italy into one group and then moved and claimed the south. South of Rome, they met on the field of battle with the forces of Giuseppe Garibaldi with minimal bloodshed, finally working out a truce. Both of the leaders, Camilla Cavour and Garibaldi, were able to come to terms. Garibaldi retired in the interest of a better Italian future, and Sardinia Piedmont completed the unification of Italy along this nationalistic drive. When that was all said and done, all the individual countries of Italy which had existed before, Roma, the Papal States, Venice, well, not Venice, but Florence, Pisa, Genoa, Sardinia Piedmont, Kingdom of Naples, all of those countries gave up their independent national status to form one large country, which would be called Italy. And when they did this with the nationalistic idea that they would only be able to compete with other nations if they were a larger unified whole. So that's how Italy in 1861 became a state. That's the origin, that's the date for the first year that Italy was in existence. In the same way, very similar fashion, basically what we see is the unification of Germany, the country Germany in 1871. The Prime Minister of Prussia, the country Prussia with a P, was a guy by the name of Otto von Bismarck. And Bismarck had been very much in favor of the Frankfurt Parliament idea of unification. It's just he was not in favor of limiting the government of Germany with that constitutional monarchy. And so what Bismarck did was he came up with a plan to force unification, without having to sign on to that new style of constitutional government. And the way that he did this was pretty clever. Basically what he did was in 1870, I believe 1870, I have to look at my notes to make sure. But he basically preempted or caused a war with Austria. And it might not make a lot of sense, but it was a fairly short war. The Prussians had the best land army in Europe, and as a result of it being basically a land war, the Prussians were very quickly able to defeat the Austrian army in the so-called Prussian-Austrian War. When the war was over, Bismarck negotiated a very lenient peace, and Austria was basically allowed to go their own separate way. And people might question, well, why even start the war in the first place? But Bismarck had a plan, and that plan was to basically eliminate Austria as a choice as a German power base. And so what Bismarck did in the next year was in 1870 he picked a war with the French over the vacancy of the Spanish crown. And as tensions degraded, he basically got France to declare war on Prussia. And if we take a look at the map of Prussia, what you'll see is that in between France and Prussia were a bunch of these little German states that would obviously be in danger from an advance of the French army. And so by creating a crisis and starting a process by which they would be threatened, he forced these German states to basically align themselves and merge with Prussia in order to protect themselves militarily, because they could not stand up to the French army by themselves. In the so-called Franco-Prussian War of 1870 to 1871, lasted less than, I believe, 6 months, the Prussians once again crushed their opposition. They crushed the French. They wound up basically toppling the government that was under the control of Louis Napoleon, who was a distant relative of the original Napoleon. They toppled that government because of the loss, and the Germans then unified as a result of the threat of war and military conquest. They all unified, Prussia and all those little bitty German states, not Austria. They all unified into the land that would be called Deutschland, which we translate to be Germany. And as a result, because of this nationalistic drive, what had been accomplished in 1861 and 1871 were the creation of 2 new countries. Now, in terms of importance, Germany was by far the more important, or the more dangerous. They not only had the land army of Prussia, but the German people had heavily industrialized and were one of the largest economies in Europe at the same time. And so the merging of Germany into a state would upset that balance of power, increasing competition and increasing aggression, which we see fully expressed by the outbreak of World War I. Germany comes together in 1871. Less than 40 years later, we have, of course, the crisis and the start of World War I. But before we close the book on nationalism, we can talk about what was happening in England and in France. These new developments, the creation of Germany, the creation of Italy, only ratcheted up the tension and the desire of both the British and the French to step up their state building and their power base. And the form that it took in the form of England is that they began to clutch tighter to the colonies and to the possessions they held outside of Europe as a power base for their state. In the case of France, the loss of the Franco-Prussian War created a vacuum which was filled by the creation of what's called the Third Republic. The First Republic being created during the First French Revolution, the Second Republic being created during the Second French Revolution, which we didn't really talk about. It occurred in 1848. And the Third Republic, which is the government of France today, was created in 1871 with the dismissal of Napoleon III, Louis Napoleon, and basically the creation of a modern constitution, a pure constitutional liberal constitution for the French state. And once that government was established, then the French set out, like the British, like the Germans, like the Italians, the French set out to try and maximize that national power. And that's going to kind of lead us up to the next big topic, which is the expression of that contest between these European powers, which is called imperialism. We'll take a look at that next. Thank you.